welcome everyone to our webinar on climate action required after COP28. We're going to recap what happened, some of the biggest things that happened, and what you need to know following that. I know it's been a few weeks, but we really wanted to summarize the changes, and we're going to talk about, I'll briefly go over who we are. Most of you might know the top 5 North American drivers for climate change that led up to and have continued to lead up to things like COP28. They're not in isolation. But there were 4 really big takeaways to look at climate action. We're just going to briefly talk about the 6 stages of climate action for any organization, and then also the 5 most regulated requirements that are out there today. So let's get started. My name is Adam Hammis. I've been in this field for about 20 years, and I have done several different things. Email me if you have any questions. Lots of certificates, lots of different industries, and I run the service delivery for North America for ESG and greenhouse gas services here at the Knowledge Division of SGS. SGS is very, we have boots on the ground around the world. We're testing, inspection, and verification services. The certification business and the third-party assurance that we do is in the Knowledge Division, which is kind of a smaller part of the company, but we have access to a huge network of affiliates that do a ton of different subject matter expertise around the world. And sustainability is and has been embedded within our company for a very long time, from the top to the bottom. Not only that, we participate in the creation of or testing of most of these standards that are coming out. We're on working groups, and we have been for over 25 to 30 years. And we get rated by a lot of the same agencies or more that you do, just to show that we know what we're doing, that we have high performance to hold our feet to the fire, and that we can serve our clients in these same areas. To get things started, we always want to get a sense of what's relevant to you, and so that you know that you're following along. So our first question that we'll send out is, has your organization completed a baseline greenhouse gas emissions inventory or a carbon footprint? Yes, no, or I don't know. I'll tell you our answer is yes. But it really just gives a sense of, if you're starting out, if COP28 was the trigger for you to decide if you're going to take action, or is the old news for you? Have you been doing this for so long that you're in your 5th, 6th, 7th, or 12th year of doing a baseline greenhouse gas emissions inventory? Typically those, we do ISO 14064-1. Greenhouse gas protocol is sort of the grandfather, the mother of all standards. That's been around much longer, but industry standard is basically becoming the ISO standards. And so if that's what you're familiar with, it could be an inventory of your whole organization. That's more typical, but some folks do product lines like ISO 14067, or projects specifically. If you only deal in like carbon credits, you might be looking for offsets and things like that. That's 14064-2. I'll give it about 5 more seconds and then just see. And I don't know, maybe you're coming here typically for the first time and you don't know. That's completely acceptable. So here is the results. So most of you, yes, some no, I don't know. Like I said, it's great to know where you're at. Any of your questions, put in the Q&A section and I'll get to them. So we have a variety of folks here, so perfect timing. You're here in a great diverse group. So let's talk about the drivers that are really pushing things, because North America is a little different than, say, South America, East Asia, and Europe. It really is, and has been for a long time, ESG ratings pressure from investor groups and some financial institutions. But these are the largest rating agencies out there, and these are being used for buy, sell, and lend decisions. That's also some of the criticism and why you see some of the legal cases, what people call ESG backlash. The ones that are typically legitimate and are having success in the courts are wanting to make sure that whatever rating is being used has a legitimate and material business interest for that industry, that it's not just an activist organization that is also non-transparent with their rating methodology. But that really has pushed most of the bigger publicly traded companies, and that continues to be one of the major drivers. It does continue to also go into the number 2 driver, is that most of those big companies are now having their scores include supply chain impacts, and some of them are being weighted sort of heavily on supply chain impacts. So that is trickling down almost into this second wave of sustainability or ESG disclosure, which greenhouse gas is usually the number one most common disclosure that we see. And those global brands, their only path to achieving their goals and improving their scores is through supplier data, supplier management, supplier transparency, traceability. And so things like the CDP, where where organizations disclose greenhouse gas emissions, they now even have a supply chain members program where 317 companies have agreed to ask all of their suppliers, and that's a huge network across the world, to submit their greenhouse gas emissions data through the CDP platform. Then there's things like EcoVadis, which is similar, but it's actually broader. It includes greenhouse gas, but it has other E, S, and G disclosures as well. And then regulatory pressure. Not to say this isn't growing and everyone's eyes are on it, but if you look at the US or North America, US and Canada, we really have, besides our greenhouse gas reporting programs for the largest, very, very heavy industrial users, that's mandatory. That is now you're seeing additional staff notices that recommend TCFD risk analysis for climate. You have a federal supplier rule in Canada that is in effect. You have the new B15, or what's referred to as B15, for federally regulated financial institutions in Canada, that they are looking at Scope 3 emissions for financed emissions. The US is a little further behind. The two big things that have happened and fairly recently is the California regulations. So if you're a large company doing business in California, now there's active regulation on climate risk and climate emissions disclosure. Also, the Fed and the FDIC have provided guidance relatively late in 2023 that they're going to require the larger banks to do at least a climate risk assessment. And then the two that have been on the kind of docket much longer, and since last COP28, that there's two proposed rules. The SEC rule change, which is more commonly understood, but there's a federal supplier climate rule as well for federal suppliers to the US government. Those are in consideration right now, although unsure, and it's an election year, so we will see. The fourth and fifth drivers are much further back. They're not as in the running with the top three, but it's still something to really consider for your business specifically, because it does matter. If you're a direct-to-consumer selling, it obviously matters because there's a huge what's called LOHAS consumer market, lifestyles of health and sustainability, that's a massive, going towards $600 billion globally. But it's a larger and larger percentage of the population each year that's essentially willing to pay more for socially and environmentally responsible products. A recent McKinsey survey globally showed that 70% of consumers are willing to pay more for a green product that performs as well as the conventional. That's called price parity. And about half of the companies rolling out new products said that business growth is the main driver of their sustainability initiatives. So companies are doing it because they see an opportunity to sell niche or just new product lines and reach new markets with their products and services. And so that's where some of the growth is coming from. And then employee pressure. Again, this is not at the lower level hourly wage part-time worker, but at the higher level skill positions, leadership positions, employee pressure to do something responsible and have a sustainability program or a greenhouse gas and climate plan has been shown time and time again to matter to some of the top talent. And there's some examples of a survey in the UK and IBM's Institute for Business Value survey that they do. So given those five, it's really important that you know, not that there's only one, usually there's a matrix of 2, 3 of different ratings, but it's good to know, like, what's your number one business driver for climate action at all? Is it really the number one most important is that you're publicly traded and you have ESG ratings, or maybe you're in something like CDP and EcoVadis and those ratings matter to your leadership? Or is it a supply chain customer that's demanding it? Are you just trying to meet new regulations or existing regulations? Are you selling to consumers, employees, other? I would say we're publicly traded, so I'll put ESG ratings for myself. But we definitely have supply chain customers that are interested. We have regulatory requirements in different countries. We're a global company, publicly traded. And our employees are very, very passionate about these issues. That's the nature of who we are. We do a lot of assurance around sustainability and training. But really be honest with yourself. What's your number one driver? Because that's going to determine how you approach any climate action. It's never, and we would never recommend just off the shelf doing what you saw somebody else do. It's really important about doing what's right for the company. Yes, you're going to do some good things for the environment and for the economy, but you have to know what your business drivers are. Otherwise, you might establish a program that doesn't work and it's not successful for your company in the long run. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds. And so very nice balance, a good group here of a lot of different reasons. If you have an other, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. I'd love to hear what your other driver is. That's always nice, and I'll share it with the group. But this is a great balanced group. So please send those questions in if you have anything, because we'll hear from a lot of different voices. And then this is a very simple one. Were you paying attention a month or so ago when COP28 conference was happening? Yes, I was, part of my job. No, you weren't. Or what's COP28? You found your way here. You're not even really sure what that means. So it's good to know, because if you were paying attention, you might have, what you will know is that there's far more. I'm not going to be able to cover it all here. What I'm going to cover today are the major things that are going to impact companies moving forward, and that you should know. There are actually there's biodiversity things mixed in. There's some social topics that get discussed. There's a lot of intersectionality happening at the COP28, but the reality is the big things people are looking for out of COP28, specifically around climate, is to see what the countries are going to agree or not agree to do. So give it about 5 more seconds. And a lot of people not paying attention, so it's probably why you're here. So I'll fill you in on the details and let you know. Here's the simplest version. COP28 is part of the UN. It's the climate change conference of the parties. So Conference of Parties is a term, COP, and there's a COP for biodiversity. There's a COP for other things, but this is the climate change COP is the 28th version. We're in the 28th year that they've done it. It started out with 165 signatory nations. It goes up and down. I think we had 200 this year. So they're all these nations and a lot of probably lobbyists and other people that show up for good, better or for worse. They show up and they have these huge conferences with lots of negotiations at the country and nation level. This year, it was a little earlier. It started in November 30th, ended December 13th, my birthday. And this one is in Dubai. And it was actually in the United Arab Emirates, obviously, but there's a lot of controversy. I won't go into it, but just having it in that location, and the president and the chair of the whole conference, if you go look in the news, you'll see plenty of the controversy around it. That happens about every year. But what's important is what the results were. And so I'll get to that. So the 4 big takeaways, there are more, I'd say, but these fundamentally are very kind of significant. One is that 200 countries all signed language and agreed to something that was, there's more to it, but a transition away from fossil fuels, which is stronger language than in the past. Some people are unhappy with the significance or the strength of it, but it is stronger than last year. There's always debate about the language, but it was a transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner so as to achieve net zero by 2050, which again, stronger language than has ever been there before. And 200 countries signing it, there's always a lot of negotiation because the intent behind the COP is to succeed in having some agreement and to keep pushing the conversation forward. And so this is, again, it continues to be the most commitment and the strongest language and wording in support of climate action and net zero by 2050 that we've ever had, including last year. The Loss and Damage Fund, which is basically didn't exist, and it's the smaller countries, especially island nations around the world that have far fewer emissions than anyone else, but are actually the most at risk from climate disaster, rising sea levels, things like that. They're already experiencing certain things that the COP has been the place for them to voice, like, it's not fair, like we should have some sort of fund that the people responsible for this are helping us deal with these disasters. And last year, the term was created for the first time. Again, it was progressive, but there was no money in it. This year, there were pledges from developed countries around the world for this multi-billion-dollar fund. It's not full yet. Most developing countries and small island nations were still frustrated that it wasn't as full as they would like it, but compared to last year, it didn't exist. Now it has funding, and quite a bit of funding, but there's still more to go. And so that continues to be something that developing countries are taking responsibility, that they produce far more emissions than some other countries. And then energy funding came out, and Julie Baldwin says more than one. So I assume you're talking about, well, you have to tell me in the thing, if more than one loss and damage fund or more than one developed country, or you'll tell me. The energy funding, another big thing, was 118 countries. You can see it start to drop. Not all the 200 that signed the transition statement signed the energy funding pledge, but 118 countries pledged to 3x their spending on renewable energy infrastructure and 2x their spending for energy efficiency, which a lot of people would point at, and I'd be one of them. It is important. It's essential that we measure. It's essential that we have policies, but in the end, we have to start switching and actually transitioning. And so funding to actually put in energy infrastructure for renewables and spend on energy efficiency, which is the most sustainable thing to do, is a fantastic thing because it's the real meat of the work that needs to be done. Leslie asked, as part of Net Zero 2050, should we be sending attendees to Dubai? Leslie, I would just say, you tell me what your purpose would be to be a part of Net Zero 2050. That's just the Paris level treaty. The Paris level treaties is to half or a 50% reduction in global emissions by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. So that's the scientific statement that was put out a while ago, and now folks have been adopting it. The science-based standards are based on that. So to participate, that is all you would have to do is do your own calculations. We'll talk about science-based targets in a second, but to send attendees to Dubai, it's a fantastic educational experience for your team, your staff, your organization. It could be if you're large and influential, maybe you have the strength to go there and influence nations. But some people go there to build coalitions and join smaller groups of companies or industry movements. It really depends on your goal. Some of our team have been there, but that's just who we are. We kind of lobby and participate in group things year round. But so that's for us. It's not essential. We do have people from SGS that go, but it really depends. It's just a giant event for nation states. So it depends on your size and your intent, but absolutely willing to talk more. And then this, again, what we usually look for is activity that is related to COP28, but is not necessarily signed or agreed upon there. So in the US, last year, the federal supplier rules for Canada and the US were announced in and around COP27. And during COP28, the US previously, I think it was in October in 2023, the Federal Reserve and the FDIC announced that they announced guidance for large banks, the largest banks, that climate risk assessments are going to be required. And then the Treasury Department during COP28, right around it, actually reviewed the ability of the 30 largest banks with $100 million in assets and over to follow that, to see what their ability was to follow that guidance that was just issued by the Fed and the FDIC. And so what you'll see is similar to Canada, banks have a huge network. And when you have the banks interested in their risk, so they're going to assess risk, and are they lending money to, usually people talk about terms like stranded assets. So do you have assets as a company that are at risk from climate change and climate transition and all these other things that are risk that the bank should be looking at and actually building into their risk analyses when they do loans and bonds and things like that? And so that the banks actually have quite a big reach. It's similar to a supply chain for a big manufacturer who has a bunch of suppliers, except the banks lend money to a lot of different types of organizations and have different asset classes. You could relate to it as like a supply chain of a big brand, but it's the lendees of the bank, and that's their quote unquote supply chain. Is who they're loaning money to. So that risk analysis matters. So all those things suggest that although there's going to be a lot of variation, a lot of diversity in how things go, there's a lot of elections coming up, but there has never been, and there continues to be, more directional agreement across nation states that we need to do this. There's not a clear path. There's not a prescriptive way of how to do it, but there's a lot of pledges, a lot of funding coming up, a lot of assessment of risk, and a lot of buy-in that some of these smaller countries shouldn't be footing the bill or being completely, forced to be in emergency situations that are being caused by larger countries who have larger emissions. So those are the four biggest takeaways. There's more, but for you and your organization, know that there's really a continued momentum in this direction. And how you can look at it is that you have 6 stages for your organization. If you're going to do climate action, all these are important. You should train internally to build competencies. You should measure whatever you're working on. If you don't have measurements, it's really hard to take action and then measure and know if your results matter. So doing a greenhouse gas inventory, and then verification, depending on the level, definitely an internal verification with your finance team or some other third-party check. But external assurances are great for stakeholders, for banks, for investors, and also for improving your scores in any rating agency. But then are you going to report that? There's mandatory reporting, but there's voluntary reporting of framework standards. How do you storytell, and to who, about what you're doing around climate? And then do you set targets? Do you adopt the science-based standards model or science-based targets model, like we'll talk about a lot, or set your own targets? What are those and why? And then actual reductions, which is the meat of it. Do you do something that improves or reduces your emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions? And then it starts over. Do you need more training? Measure again, verify, report targets reduction. And that's the process for any organization to go through. I'll mention here to just really do a self-check for yourself again. What stage of climate action does your organization find most challenging? Because it depends on where you're at. Sometimes that first series of steps, that first cycle, can take 2 to 3 years. If you want to kind of slow roll into it, you don't have a lot of pressure, maybe you really take your time. But then you typically get on an annual cycle, and you'll have very noticeable pain points. Are you lacking credentials within your own organization? Do you need that internal training? And as a vendor, I will even say, yes, we love working with companies, but it's more important. The companies are more successful when they build their internal competencies, and you can still hire a vendor to help, but you're going to manage that vendor and know what you're getting as a product or service if you're trained. And then you've got to measure, verify, report targets. But which ones are the hardest for your organization? Where do you struggle the most? And I would say for us, it's probably in the reductions, because we are a giant global company who mostly ships people around the world. And lately we've been dealing with a lot of just, the airline industries, and pre and post COVID, just going through a lot of transition. And most of our scope 3 is sending our people and auditors and assurers around the world to provide that third-party assurance. So having those reductions at a scope 3 level is very tricky, as it is for most people. Scope 3 becomes more difficult. But I'll give you about 5 more seconds. What's the most challenging for you? And here, another really good balance. What I'm pleasantly surprised at is no one put reporting. So hopefully you've got a decent amount of communications and marketing people, and also people who understand the standards and frameworks to do the reporting. So that's great. I love to see that. So let's talk about training. And this is a little bit of, I only have this highlighted because we're training you now. What are the most regulated actions? Because those are going to have the most teeth. So what is actually being regulated by different countries around the world, and definitely in the US and Canada, and how is that going to help you? So if you look at it in order of most regulated, it's TCFD reporting, which we'll talk about. That's more climate risk reporting. Greenhouse gas accounting, just requiring that you count. Greenhouse gas verification, getting some third-party assurance. Greenhouse gas targets. And last is CDP reporting. And if you know that, it's a great place to start and build your capacity and do more training. But let's look at them one by one. TCFD, and I wish I would have put it on here, but I don't want to confuse people more. Essentially, it's actually, I'll go first what it was, and then I'll tell you what it is today. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures it's a framework. So it's not a prescriptive report these KPIs like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064-1. It's really about discussion and analysis of your governance structure around climate change. Hopefully it's integrated into your governance of other ESG issues, your strategy around climate risk, your actual risk management and identification of your key risks, and what are your metrics and targets. So there's 4 categories that they just ask you to report in, and they want it to be in line with your annual reporting. So it's not a separate, it can be a separate document, but it has to be integrated into your annual financials or your quarterly financials, however you typically report. TCFD has been around for a while. It's the standard that has been referenced the most globally in any regulations, and that's because it was less prescriptive and it was very kind of general 4 categories and had risk analysis built in. It has actually now been absorbed along with SASB standards and Integrated Reporting Foundation into, first it was the Value Reporting Foundation, I believe, and now it's in IFRS. And so this matters for Canada, more for the US, but if you do business internationally, IFRS is in almost every other country besides China and the US. We use GAAP. China uses something else. But IFRS itself is the International Financial Reporting Standards, and they've rolled out in June of last year S1 and S2, which are these, one is a catch-all. S1 is like, here's how to report on ESG and sustainability metrics generally, and it takes sort of all the best principles from TCFD, SASB, and IR and puts them in one place. So it's simplified. And then there's specific topics. So S2 is the very first one. It's the only one at this point, but it's the climate standard. So it goes a little bit further, and it provides very specific kind of KPIs under that were similar to TCFD, but the truth is TCFD has sort of been absorbed, and it is in IFRS S2. Sorry for all the confusion, but people will still say TCFD probably for the next 5 years. So it's important that you know what it is. But that is the #1 regulated action, and it probably will continue to be because it aligns with typical business reporting of public companies already. Here's why. I just mentioned all that. I should have went to the next page, but there's a clear line between standards. So this is why it's an improvement of the alphabet soup of ESG. Integrated Reporting, SASB and TCFD, Value Reporting Foundation, now it's in IFRS, and S1 and S2. That's all ESG. It's pure financial materiality. All of that is being decided in multi-stakeholder groups with investors, banks, and industry all at the table together. It is not any of the feel-good, kind of excite your employees and your customers type of stuff. It's really about risk management, whereas sustainability standards that tend to have what's called impact materiality, or sometimes called double materiality because it's financial plus impact materiality, are things like the GRI standard as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're also trying to grow and evolve together, but they're not going to absorb into each other. Everything above the line is more of an investor kind of bank industry risk-driven standard. Everything below is more for the progressive companies who are doing it as a part of their brand, believe it should be done, and are also marketing it to their customers and or employees. And so that's why climate made its way into S2, and it's very, very much a part of public disclosure internationally for years to come. This is why if you're going to get a PDF of this, but you can download the TCFD standard. It's nice to have, but it's probably more realistic. Just download the IFRS S1 and S2. Again, here's all the information I talked about it. It's still very much new, but it does become effective. It was effective January 1 for all reporting. So at the end of this year, companies are going to internationally be reporting on S1 and S2. Here's a good, just an example if that was confusing. TCFD used to just be governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. But then when you added beyond S1, S2 actually added all these extra categories that they wanted you to specifically put in, and an example of a deeper dive. So cross-industry metrics, they wanted you to pick things from this list. Are the risks to your organization climate-related transition risks, climate-related physical risks, climate-related opportunities, capital deployment, internal carbon prices, or remuneration? And so again, it's a menu. It's still not as prescriptive, but it's a lot more prescriptive than TCFD used to be, and it gives additional categorical disclosures that you need. Okay, that was just number one. So that was a lot, but TCFD, now IFRS S2, still continues to be the most regulated climate action anywhere, including North America. And then next is just greenhouse gas accounting, expecting companies to disclose scope 1, scope 2, and sometimes scope 3 emissions. Is the greenhouse gas protocol. It's established in 2001. It's been around forever. There's a corporate accounting and reporting standard. It just does everything. It tells you how to set boundaries, what kind of control approach to take, what emission types there are, what different greenhouse gases you can choose from. It helps you find emission factors, but it also points you in the direction of other emission factors databases, and then helps you do calculations. And so all of that is fantastic and important, and is necessary because of the measurement piece. And then again, it's dropping off a little bit, but more and more proposed regulations are starting to have actual verification, or what they'll call it is assurance. But in the greenhouse gas world, it's greenhouse gas verification. It's been around for a long time, but it is actually certifying, verifying, and validating to a standard that of your level of accuracy. There's 3 different ones that are the most common. You can do greenhouse gas protocol, which I mentioned. That's an unaccredited standard, but there's 14064-1 for organizational footprints. These are all accredited in ISO. You can do 14064-2, that's project footprints, often associated with carbon offsets, and then product footprints for specific product lines. That's ISO 14067. And then if you're looking at assurance, what does that look like? So I kind of put it next to, because some companies are familiar with greenhouse gas and not familiar with sustainability report assurance. Some are the other way around. But on the top is what you see with like broad ESG and sustainability reports, a 12-year report at the end of the year. You have your trainings that you can take. You have execution, which is doing like a materiality assessment or a gap analysis. And then you have something called a pre-assurance. And you don't have to do that, but it's an option. And then you have actual assurance. You can just do KPIs, or you can do fully like a GRI report assurance or an AA1000 report assurance. But you can do limited, just like a CPA firm would do. There's a limited level of rigor, and there's a reasonable level of rigor to that assurance, reasonable being the most rigorous. And it's the same thing in greenhouse gas. If you just do your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, assurance is very similar. You should get training. You can do greenhouse gas accounting services. Some people do CDP advisory and science-based targets advisory. You can do something called a gap analysis, which is less rigorous, it's cheaper, it's easier, but it's not an actual assurance. It doesn't fully count as an assurance by a third party. But then you actually have a greenhouse gas verification that is considered an assurance level at limited or reasonable level. That just determines the threshold. So the threshold that we'll see is if it's limited, everything, any emission factor, any emission category that is at 10% or more of your total emissions is sampled and down to source evidence. Where if it's reasonable, it's a higher sampling. Anything 5% of your total emissions or higher is sampled. And so that's how limited and reasonable differ. But that's where assurance is starting to become more and more commonplace, and actually in regulation mentioning you're going to have assurance. So this is an example here on the right and left. I won't go into detail because I just talked a little bit about it, but assurance means you're actually going to get a certificate or a statement of opinion. That statement itself will have a detailed scope with all the boundaries of what it is and what it isn't saying, and the results. That sampling threshold, like I said, is a 10% versus a 5%. Some people don't know this, but one is a negative opinion. It just says, we did not find evidence that any of these claims are false, versus we did find evidence that these claims are true. And that's, again, from the CPA world, from the financial approach. And then scopes 1 through 3 emissions, if you look at the difference and why people choose like greenhouse gas protocol, it only recommends scope 3, which are your value chain emissions, whereas ISO 14064-1 requires an assessment and a significance and a risk assessment, and you have to justify excluding any scope 3 emissions. And this is just a little chart that tells you all the same stuff. The level of rigor gets higher when it goes from limited to reasonable, or from greenhouse gas protocol to ISO. Hold on, we got a great question coming in. It's taking up a huge portion Tim, hopefully I get all this. How are the actions of investor companies like Vanguard and BlackRock, investors pulling back from investments in ESG and greenhouse gas companies that are fully in the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting standards, affecting concerns of companies and investors that are leery of the ESG push for net zero goals for 2030 and 2050? Well, I'll tell you that I'm not them. So I can tell you my professional opinion is that when you look at what people are pulling back from, I would call it a slowing down. The investments, what they're being careful of is, and this is the valuable and worthwhile criticisms, which always should exist in anything. When you kind of have this sea change of ESG, it's been around for like 50, 60 years. So it's now just becoming like really heavily adopted. So it's getting more interest and more criticism than ever before, and rightfully so. And a lot of the criticism was around the lack of judiciousness in what they consider an ESG fund. People were just slapping a name, because ESG itself, in its purest form of where it came from, people have kind of used it in a lot of poor or false ways. But what it is very rigorous. It's very time-tested. It's material. It's financial material exercise. But there are a ton of people taking advantage of a good thing, or whatever you want to call it, and just slapping funds with this ESG name or this ESG, and they were just branding things with very little oversight of what was considered an ESG fund. And for good reasons, people were critical, saying, whoa, like, slow down. You shouldn't just do this sort of with anything, and there should be standards on what you can call an ESG fund and how you should label these, because some people are clearly just doing it and have no basis for what this is, and no standard for what the funds themselves are. So a few things happening. People are slowing down. I wouldn't say it's definitely, when you say pulling back, it's really like a slowing down. And there's very valid criticism of the system, that what the intention is to get it worked out. And so what I fully expect to see is that those things are going to get ironed out. Europe is sort of pushing and leading. That could slow down. Anything could slow down with changes in elections. So we'll always keep an eye on that. But the reality is it's mostly coming from investors. And whether they slow down, it'd be very different if they were stopping and turning around and retreating. But that's typically not the case. It's still growth. It's just not as fast of growth. But very good question. And I kind of bounced all over, but those are my random thoughts. What level of verification does your organization have in place? We have, we do limited assurance of our greenhouse gas for CDP. And I'm wondering if it actually need to check. I know that we're trying to increase our score, but I know our scope 3 is limited assurance. It could be reasonable assurance on our scope 1 and 2. I'm actually on the service delivery team, and I interact with our internal team, but that's not my specific role. So I'll give it about 5 more seconds for you. I'll just put limited because I don't want to overstate. We're a conservative bunch here, and we've got none for verification. Internal review a lot, which I highly recommend. That's definitely better than nothing. External review, it's cheaper. You can do something like a gap analysis is typically considered external review. You don't get a certificate or a statement of opinion. And then we have some folks with reasonable assurance. Some publicly traded companies are definitely going after reasonable. It's a valid argument that if your financials are integrated with your non-financials, that you should do the entire report at the same level of assurance. The tricky part is that non-financials are not the same as financials, and there's competing approaches. And so we will get that all sorted out, but it's definitely another good mix here. I'll mention that we have training. Training is always available. I always recommend it. We have training built on like an introduction course for anybody. March 11th. We have them quarterly, but the next one's coming March 11th, March 12th through the 15th. We have an ISO 14064-1 course, an ISO 14064-2 course for projects. We have a 14067 product footprint course. And if you actually want to do this for a living or just be so talented that you're super confident you're going to get verified on the internal side, we have a verifier course. So we train people to do what we do for a living, which is verify greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a 5-day course. You would take all 5 of these. So greenhouse gas, action number 4 of the most, and again, we're getting to the bottom of the list, but still regulated, is setting of targets and reduction targets. By far the most common and the one that's in regulations that you will see are setting science-based targets. That is something that aligns with the Paris treaties that were signed a decade ago. Those are what we talked about earlier. It's a 50% reduction by 2030. It's wherever you can get your earliest baseline, and then it's a net zero by 2050. So it does have a long lag, but it's still not easy. There's a lot of solutions that we'll need to come up with in the meantime, but that's the scientific consensus of and why most people are jumping onto this SBTI initiative, because it has the most comprehensive agreement and backing and measurement tools to it. You can set different standards, but you don't have the same tools at your disposal. Whereas PAS 2060 has been around for a long time. They're actually coming out with a new ISO standard, 14068, but it's not, I think it's maybe just released and it's kind of like in its infancy, but it will probably replace, ISO usually replaces all of these initial ones eventually. But you can do a carbon neutral standard, and that just really depends on what your claims are. It determines how you're able to communicate. Often it's with offsets or reductions, or and there are different qualifications of what will be counted and what won't be counted. So it's really important, if you want to go for a carbon neutral claim, that you really do your due diligence on what kind of program you want to use. And last, but not least, CDP Climate Reporting. Tools they're the least likely, and I'll say the place I've seen this is in the US Federal Supplier Rule. They actually listed CDP as the reporting tool that they wanted federal suppliers to use. And so that's the only time I'm familiar with CDP actually being stated in regulation. But it wouldn't surprise me, because EcoVadis on the ESG side and CDP on the greenhouse gas side specifically, their adoption rates internationally are high. They're kind of hockey stick right now. They're growing pretty quickly, and they're just similarly tools that have the most backing, the most kind of approval of their usability, the rigor, and they have these supply chain mandates coming down from big suppliers. So CDP and EcoVadis are getting adopted very quickly, and that's probably why you'll see more. I would expect more than just the US to start actually listing tools like CDP in their regulations. But I've only seen it in the White House Federal Supplier Rule. That is only a proposed rule, and we'll learn more after the election, as it always happens. In general, just mention that we have definitely services. Reach out to us at any time. We do greenhouse gas accounting. We can't do verification and accounting for obvious reasons. We're a verifier. But if you're not interested in assurance and you don't see that on your time horizon, we're more than talented and skilled and experienced in doing the accounting ourselves. We do CDP and TCFD help. We do verifications of all the standards. We also do advisory on science-based targets and verification of carbon neutral claims. And so we've got a whole suite, as well as if you're in the broader ESG and sustainability space. But I'll leave this with you because really climate is our focus today. So what can you do? This is the summary slide. You really need to understand the way you're going to make climate action add value to your business and not be some sort of knee-jerk reaction or a response that you feel like is a huge waste of your time or it's very frustrating. Is really look for, do we have real business drivers, ratings, supply chain customers, regulatory pressure, consumers, employees, and which ones and to which degree are those drivers? Because you can build and tailor your approach to that. Then you can just look at the different stages to go through: training, measurement, verification, disclosure, targets, reductions, and start making improvements and beefing up your own internal capacity to do those things successfully, as you see needed by whatever the strategy is and what those business drivers were, and then really take into consideration, okay, these are the top 5 regulated actions now. Am I ready for that? Even if it's not in your industry today, there's a very good chance it's going to come in the future. And so we're typically, if you look at Europe, South America, and East Asia, 5-ish years behind when it comes to any of these regulatory kind of movements. That's pretty consistent. It's things that vary all the time, but if you want to look for examples of what's happening, look no further than our friends across the pond, and you'll see that there's probably a likelihood of this increasing. Regardless, of the election, there will always be every 4 years another change. And so we have these pretty confident things that you're going to see, and at least on your own timeline, decide what should you be preparing for, and more importantly, why, because that will determine your whole strategy. So last thing I'll put is, what's your current priority for climate change? What do you want to do next? Do you want to look at TCFD reporting, greenhouse gas accounting, greenhouse gas verification, greenhouse gas targets, maybe CDP reporting, or some other issue? I'm going to put, I wish I had it in here. CDP reporting. I think we're always trying to get to the A list. We're an A-, and we always like to be A list. So I think my team has actually been trying to offer our assistance back up to the global team, because they have to handle a lot of complex affiliates around the world, but we'd like to be at that A list. It's better for us. It proves our credentials, and it puts us at the top of a very good list. So for us, CDP reporting is the priority, but we're pretty evolved or mature in these other categories. And if you've got an other, please put it in. And then Tim has another question. As people go, I'll give you a few more seconds and I'll read Tim's question. I've done some research on the science and looked at studies supporting both sides of the CO2 GHG reports. The scientists on both sides seem to have matching experience and qualifications on the subject. So how do people that want to really know, use the term science-based, how do they know whose science is correct? So when you say GHG reports, are you talking about, at the beginning, it sounded like you're looking at greenhouse gas reports. In my world, greenhouse gas reports are emission inventories of organizations. But then I read the second half of your question, and it seems like maybe just the science of climate change, that you question whether it's valid. And so you can let me know. But I would say on the greenhouse gas reporting side, actually, I'll say on them both. I think that it's very similar to what I said earlier. There's always valid criticism. What I would just be careful not to let criticism equate to false, because disproving something is a lot different than pointing out failures or weaknesses, I should say, in the science. Because the truth of it is, even if you're an organization, you're well aware, especially in your first phase of greenhouse gas reporting, you might have, if you do scope 3, you're using a ton of estimations the first year, and then you're taking estimations and multiplying them by emission factors, which, if you know what emission factors are, those are averages from studies, so also not primary data. But so it's very imperfect, and there's plenty of ways to point to the imperfection in the measurement. And if you're in it for longer, you move towards primary data, and most of the industry initiatives are trying to move from estimates, which are good enough, but they're not the ideal, but moving towards primary data so you can measure. Climate science is a very similar thing. When you're trying to measure the sheer volume of diverse factors in the global atmosphere and trying to narrow it down, you're measuring at various locations around the world, and there's just so many factors in it. So it's far from perfect. But to say that it has been disproved, I would say there's been multiple people who have pointed to the imperfections in the science. And then over the last 30 so years, what we've continued to see is to get better at the science. And that's not easy. That's just my opinion, and I'm perfectly happy for people to disagree with me. But it's hard to find something that is as complex as this topic and the factors that people are trying to control for. And so I see why some people are definitely questionable or doubtful, or even, have completely different views. I don't feel that way. But I have a science background in my earlier years, and I find that it's an imperfect system that has been gradually and steadily improving. And with what we've seen, I haven't seen any veers off of the path, but there've been really, what I always say is, valid criticisms and then opportunities to get more primary data. But you're dealing with I don't want to use vulgar language, just a real lot of factors when you're talking about global atmosphere. And so that's just me. I'll stop talking. But thank you, Tim. That's a great question. And I think everybody has to kind of decide that for themselves. But I'm happy to share. I see an other here. What's your current priority? And possibly it's no priorities. But if you have another and you want to put it in the Q&A, also we have about 9 minutes left. I have all of the different rules proposed and otherwise on here, but I was only those are just kind of appendix. I didn't want to show them. So what questions, I'll jump to the end and just put it on the questions mark. But do you have questions for me? Do you want to see some of these breakdowns of the different rules and proposed rules in Canada and the US? Because I have slides for them. Jeanette Molina, in regard to supply, thank you for your question. In regard to supply chain partners impact, such as logistics companies, are there requirements less since we are not a manufacturing company? I don't think I have. I wish I had a scope 1, 2, and 3 sort of graphic on here. It's a great question. What's typically the case is that you'll see the larger companies have much more pressure to measure scope 3, which is their value chain, upstream and downstream emissions. If you are a logistics company, especially if you're a small or medium-sized logistics company, the pressure for you, and this is likelihoods. It all comes down. I would never say take something off the shelf, but the likelihood is you're going to have more pressure and possibly only pressure to disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions. And those are emissions that they're from your assets. So you own a building, a vehicle, a piece of equipment, mobile or stationary or otherwise, natural gas, refrigerants, liquid fuels, things like that, that you own it. If the emissions had a color, like green smoke, you would see it leaving your property. That's scope 1. Scope 2 is usually your electricity or your steam. It's purchased, but they give you take credit for it or accountability for it, even though it was generated out at the power plant. And that's for the reason that's going to be the pressure for you. One, it's the easiest to measure, and your scope 1 and 2 emissions are the scope 3 emissions of the bigger players. And so that's why it's needed. These bigger companies are asked to do scope 3 reporting. The first thing and the most critical thing is that they need scope 1 and 2 emissions from you. Unless you yourself are a large publicly traded company, then you yourself as a logistics company might be asked to do scope 3 emissions. So I'm trying to give you scenarios just because I don't know you personally, Jeanette, but hopefully that helped. And then Dr. Gordon, response to other, educating small and medium manufacturing companies and nonprofits around ESG and potential risk, ignoring it. Yeah, so that's a great reason. So Dr. Gordon is an educator himself about the issue. Tim says, one thing that strikes me as odd is that nurseries use CO2 machines to increase the CO2 levels to grow plants faster and healthier. So how does lowering the CO2 levels in the atmosphere affect the growth and health of plants that are naturally growing? That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm definitely not someone to tell you how it will affect the plants, but the trend of CO2 in the atmosphere going up I have not seen plants, maybe it's because we have such rapid deforestation in certain places, and we're dealing with other issues, not just climate change. It's just one of many things. I have not seen any studies around, our plants growing like we would be just returning to kind of pre-industrial levels somewhere in, I don't know if it's like the 80. Very few people have research back or if any data back past the 90s. And so very few people are going to return even like net zero. We don't have data back that far. So all we can do is try to go back to some earlier date where we were already alive and plants had that same amount of CO2 in the air. And so we're not trying to yank out anymore. Right now we're dealing with the opposite problem. Maybe plants are growing faster than typical because the trend is going up. But my guess is that we wouldn't have that problem for plants growing slower until we got back to net zero. And then if like somehow we went in the opposite direction, which I don't see that happening, definitely not before 2050. And we're going to be challenged to do the net zero by 2050. But this fantastic question. I've never heard that asked before. And I'm not a climate scientist, so big surprise. But C. Chow, is there a risk of double dipping or duplication in reporting, as Scope 1 emissions could be Scope 2 or 3 for another entity? It's a great question, and that's why there are the buckets. It can be confusing, but it's actually intended to avoid, we call it double counting in the industry or duplication, because Scope 1 cannot be Scope 2. Scope 2 is always one company's emissions from energy or electricity or steam, and then Scope 1 are all of the other things. They're always kind of mandatory together. Scope 1 and 2 are like, they're their own bucket, but Scope 2 is just defined because it's not on site. And Scope 3 are everything in your value chain. And so the counting is that one organization never adds their Scope 3 emissions to another organization's Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 they're like a contextual statement. They show areas for opportunity, but you never bundle Scope 3 and add them to somebody's Scope 1 and 2. The only thing that you'll do is aggregate other people's Scope 1 and 2 to get to an aggregate number that equates to some other organization's Scope 3. And I'm sorry if that was confusing, but there is a lot about the standards that say we don't double count. And typically we only count Scope 1 and 2 as those primary emissions. And then when we count Scope 3, you never add them together. The only thing you're allowed to do is aggregate outside entities into a Scope 3 number. And that's why you don't add anybody's Scope 3 emissions together. That would be the epitome of double, triple, quadruple, or like 1,000 times X. So you should not, and if you see anybody counting Scope 3 emissions and adding them all together, that's a big no-no. Tim says, I have a greenhouse. I've used this and seen my plants thrive better in the house than in my outdoor garden. That, it could be. That's fantastic. Plants need CO2 and we need oxygen. So we have a wonderful dynamic relationship together. Maybe we'll get better forests out of the deal, but also other problems. It's 1:58. I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for great questions, everybody. This is fantastic. If you have any more, email us. I'd be happy to continue these conversations. I know that Summer will send out a recording or the link to the PowerPoint. Like I said, there's a lot of links in here, including to the standards that I referenced, so that you can come back and use this anytime you want. If you need any help with any of those things above that we can help you with, that's great. We'd love to be of service to your business, and best of wishes for 2024 and the rest of the year. Have a great day, everyone.